This isn't a story about revenge. Not really. It's a story about a town that buried a girl alive, thinking the dirt would hold her down forever. But they forgot one thing. Some seeds only grow in the dark. And the one they planted 14 years ago? It was about to bloom into something they couldn't possibly imagine. Something with thorns. The woman who stepped off the private coach in the middle of Willowbrook, Montana in 1892 didn't look like a ghost. Ghosts are supposed to be pale and thin, wisps of what they once were. This woman was the opposite. She was a force of nature, dressed in emerald green silk that must have cost more than the entire general store she was staring at. Her hair was pinned up in a way that meant business, and her eyes swept over the familiar, dusty street with an unnerving stillness. She was cataloging every face, every building, every memory, and she was placing them all on a ledger in her mind. The folks loitering on the porch of Henderson's store, they stopped talking. The sound of a hammer from the blacksmith shop fell silent. For a moment, the only sound in Willowbrook was the clicking of the woman's expensive boots on the hard-packed dirt. No one recognized her. Why would they? The last time they saw Clara Morrison, she was 13 years old, pregnant, crying, and being shoved onto a stagecoach headed for oblivion. A town's dirty little secret, sent away to be forgotten. They had all agreed it was for the best. They had all agreed she was ruined. But the woman standing before them now wasn't ruined. She looked like she could buy the whole damn town and turn it into a parking lot for her other, more important towns. And that's when old man Henderson, his eyes squinting against the morning sun, felt a cold rock drop in his stomach. He remembered that chin, that defiant tilt of the head. Clara, he whispered, the name a puff of dust in the silent air. Clara Morrison? The woman's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no forgiveness. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey after a very, very long hunt. "Hello, Willowbrook," she said, her voice calm and clear and carrying a terrifying weight. "It's good to be home." But this wasn't a homecoming. It was a reckoning. And no one in that town had any idea of the hell that was about to break loose. Because Clara hadn't come back for apologies. She'd come back to collect a debt, and she was prepared to foreclose on their entire world. 14 years earlier, Clara Morrison was just the blacksmith's daughter, a girl with a mind too sharp for her own good. While other girls learned needlepoint, Clara learned the difference between pig iron and steel. While they whispered about boys, she asked the traveling preacher why God gave women brains if they weren't meant to use them. The town called her peculiar. Joshua Blackwood called her special. He was the son of Richard Blackwood, the cattle baron who owned half the valley and had a mortgage on the other half. Joshua was 18, handsome, and knew exactly what to say to a 13-year-old girl who felt like no one in the world understood her. He didn't talk to her about needlepoint. He talked to her about ideas, about the world beyond the mountains. He made her feel like her sharp mind was a gift, not a curse. He started visiting the smithy, bringing in tools that weren't broken and horses that didn't need shoeing, just for a chance to talk to her, to watch her. His blue eyes promised a future that glittered brighter than the sparks from her father's anvil. And Clara, who had never been looked at that way before, fell for it completely. He told her they had to meet in secret, that his father wouldn't approve, not yet. He said he wanted to know the real her, away from the prying eyes of the town. Their spot was an old prospector's cabin, a mile out of town, a place where promises could be whispered without witnesses. He talked of love. He talked of marriage. He said he'd ask her father for her hand as soon as she turned 16. He made a 13-year-old girl feel like a woman. For 3 months, it was a whirlwind of stolen glances and secret meetings. Clara lived a double life, the dutiful daughter by day, the woman in love by night. The lies she told her parents were easy because they were paving the way to a future she thought was guaranteed. The future of being Mrs. Joshua Blackwood. But Joshua Blackwood wasn't building a future. He was just passing the time. His real future had already been arranged. A marriage to Rebecca Chambers, the daughter of another cattle baron from the next county. A union of land and money that would make the Blackwood Empire untouchable. Clara was just a dalliance, a secret to be enjoyed and then discarded. And then the secret stopped being secret. When Clara told him she was pregnant, she expected joy. She expected him to say this would speed up their plans. She expected him to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. She walked to that cabin with a terrified but hopeful heart, ready to start their real life together. But the boy she met there wasn't the boy she knew. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating panic. He didn't step toward her. He stepped back. "That's impossible," he said, his voice flat. "You're mistaken," Clara insisted. She was sure. And that's when the mask didn't just slip. It shattered. He accused her of trying to trap him, of lying. He sneered and said he was a Blackwood, and he would not be brought down by the blacksmith's daughter. He even had the cruelty to suggest it might not be his, that a girl like her, well, who knew who else she'd been meeting in that cabin? The words were like stones, each one hitting her harder than the last. The boy she loved, the future she had dreamed of. It was all turning to smoke and ash right before her eyes. "But your promises," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You said you loved me. You said we'd be married." Joshua laughed, a bitter, ugly sound that echoed in the small cabin. "You can't be that naive," he said, shaking his head. "Girls like you should know better than to believe everything a man says." He turned and walked out of the cabin without a backward glance, leaving her alone with the ruins of her life and the new life growing inside her. Clara stumbled home in a daze. For a week she said nothing, hoping it was all a nightmare, hoping he would come to his senses. Then the announcement appeared in the territorial newspaper, the engagement of Joshua Blackwood to Miss Rebecca Chambers, and Clara knew she was utterly, completely alone. The thing about secrets in a town like Willowbrook is that they have a shelf life, and a pregnant 13-year-old is a secret that's going to spoil fast. Her mother, Margaret, was the first to notice. The confrontation was quiet, devastating, and ended with Clara sobbing out the whole sordid story. Her father's reaction was anything but quiet. Thomas Morrison was a good man, a respected man. He'd never so much as raised his voice to his daughter. But when he heard Joshua Blackwood's name, something inside him broke. A quiet man's rage is a terrifying thing to see. He didn't say a word. He just wiped the grease from his hands, put on his coat, and marched out of the house. Anyone who saw the look on his face knew exactly where he was going. He found Joshua at the Blackwood Ranch, overseeing the grooming of a prize stallion. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He grabbed the boy by his fine linen shirt, lifted him clean off the ground, and slammed him against the barn wall. The blacksmith's hands were like iron vices. "You will marry my daughter," Thomas growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "You will do right by her, or so help me God, I will tear you apart with my bare hands." Joshua, to his credit, didn't seem scared. He just seemed annoyed. He knew he held all the cards. He had his father's name, his father's money, and a dozen ranch hands within shouting distance. He brushed himself off and looked Thomas Morrison in the eye with pure, cold contempt. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Joshua said calmly. "Your daughter is lying. I've never touched her. If she's in trouble, she should look for the father among the stable boys, where she belongs." The lie was so perfect, so complete, that for a second, Thomas almost faltered. But he knew his daughter, and he knew the smug look of a rich boy who had never faced a consequence in his life. The confrontation solved nothing, but it did something worse. It turned a private shame into a public spectacle. The story ripped through Willowbrook like a prairie fire. And in a town built on reputation, the sides were chosen before the first day was out. It was the Blackwoods, the most powerful family in the county, against the Morrisons, a simple blacksmith and his peculiar daughter. It was never a fair fight. People preferred the comfortable lie to the ugly truth. It was easier to believe that Clara Morrison was a promiscuous little tramp than to believe that Joshua Blackwood, their golden boy, was a predator and a coward. The whispers started first, then the stares. Women who used to greet Clara with a smile now crossed the street to avoid her. Friends she'd known her whole life were forbidden from speaking to her. Business at the smithy dried up. Wagons that needed mending were suddenly taken to the next town over. The final nail in the coffin was hammered in by Reverend Patterson. From the pulpit, he preached about the wages of sin, About the Jezebels who tempt good men from the path of righteousness? He never said Clara's name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Clara Morrison had become a lesson, a warning. The pressure mounted, a slow, suffocating weight on the Morrison family. But the true architect of their destruction wasn't the town gossip. It was a man who operated from the shadows. Richard Blackwood, Joshua's father. He didn't make public accusations. He didn't need to. He just made a few quiet visits. One to the bank that held the mortgage on the Morrisons' home and shop. Another to the merchants who supplied Thomas with his coal and iron. Suddenly, the Morrisons' loan was called in. Their credit was cut off. They were being systematically strangled, and everyone knew who was tightening the noose. The town council meeting was just a formality. It was held in the back room of Henderson's store. Richard Blackwood was there, speaking softly about the need to protect the town's moral character, to remove any corrupting influences. The verdict was swift. Thomas Morrison was given a choice: send his daughter away or face complete and utter ruin. He could lose his business, his home, everything he had worked his entire life to build. It wasn't a choice. It was an execution order. The night before she left, the Morrison house was silent. Margaret had packed a small bag. Thomas had arranged for Clara to be sent to a distant aunt in Oregon, a woman she'd never even met. The plan was for her to have the baby, give it up for adoption, and then, well, no one knew what happened then. You don't make long-term plans for a ghost. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered into the silence, the words tasting like ash. "I'm so sorry." Her mother held her, both of them crying without making a sound. Her father stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders shaking with a rage he couldn't unleash and a grief he couldn't voice. The next morning, a single seat was booked on the westbound stagecoach. As Clara climbed aboard, she saw the whole town was out to watch, not to say goodbye, but to make sure she was really leaving. And standing on the porch of the hotel, watching her go with a cold, satisfied smirk, was Joshua Blackwood. He had won. He had gotten everything he wanted, and he'd paid no price at all. As the stagecoach pulled away, Clara looked back at the only home she'd ever known. She made a vow, a silent, burning promise to herself. This wasn't the end. They thought they were burying her, but she would not be buried. The world they were sending her into was hard and unforgiving. They expected it to break her. They had no idea that she was just like her father's steel. The harder you beat her, the stronger she was going to get. The journey west wasn't a trip to a kindly aunt in Oregon. That was just the story her parents told the town. A gentle fiction to soften the brutal truth. Thomas Morrison, backed into a corner by Richard Blackwood, had been given one option: a charitable institution run by a fire and brimstone church sect in the wilds of the Oregon Territory. St. Jude's Home for Penitent Women. It wasn't a home, it was a prison. Clara figured that out the moment the stagecoach left her at the gates. It was a tall, grim-looking stone building surrounded by a high wall, topped with jagged, broken glass. The woman who met her at the door, Matron Agnes, had a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. "Another fallen dove," the matron said, her voice like grinding stones. "Well, you've come to the right place. We'll burn the sin right out of you here." The next 6 months were a blur of hard labor, thin soup, and constant prayer. The girls at St. Jude's worked from sunup to sundown in the institution's commercial laundry, their hands raw and bleeding from the harsh lye soap. They weren't penitents. They were unpaid labor. Clara learned quickly: keep your head down, do your work, never ever let them see you cry. She learned about the world in that place. The other girls came from all over, each with a story of betrayal. They were daughters of rich men and poor men, but they all ended up in the same place, scrubbing the filth from other people's clothes while their bellies swelled. She also learned that the matron was running a side business. The babies born at St. Jude's rarely went to orphanages. They were sold, quietly, discreetly, to wealthy, childless couples who were willing to pay a high price for a healthy infant and no questions asked. The girls never saw their children. The moment they were born, they were whisked away. The mothers were given a few days to recover, then sent on their way with $1 and a warning to never come back. Clara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she would rather die than let them take her baby. As her time grew near, she started planning. She stole scraps of food, hiding them away. She studied the guards' routines. She found a loose board in the back of the laundry that led out to the yard. It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was all she had. Her daughter was born on a cold, rainy April night, in a stark, sterile room with only a grim-faced nurse for company. The labor was long and brutal, but Clara held on to one thought. She had to stay conscious. She had to stay strong. They let her hold the baby for only a moment, a tiny, perfect little girl. Clara looked into her daughter's eyes and felt a surge of love so fierce it was like a physical blow. "I'll call her Elizabeth," she whispered. The nurse took the baby away. "You rest now," she said. "The matron will see to the arrangements." Clara didn't rest. That night, fueled by a primal fear and a mother's rage, she put her plan into motion. She slipped out of the infirmary, her body screaming in protest. She made her way to the nursery, a small room lined with stark white cots. She found Elizabeth, wrapped her in a stolen blanket, and held her tight. The escape was a nightmare of shadows and close calls. She pried the loose board away and slipped into the muddy yard. The wall was her biggest obstacle. It was slick with rain, the broken glass at the top glinting in the moonlight. She had no rope, no help, but she had something more powerful. She had a child to protect. She found a stack of old crates near the wall. They were rotten and unstable, but they would have to do. She climbed, her bare feet slipping, her stitches pulling. Elizabeth held tight against her chest. She reached the top, carefully navigating the jagged glass, slicing her hands and arms in the process. She jumped. She landed hard in the mud outside the walls, the impact jarring every bone in her body. For a moment she lay there, gasping for breath, the rain washing the blood from her cuts. But Elizabeth was safe. She hadn't made a sound. Clara Morrison, now 14 years old, was a fugitive, a penniless, injured girl with a newborn baby, alone in the wilderness of the Oregon Territory. According to the world, she had nothing. But as she held her daughter close, she knew she had everything that mattered, and she would burn the whole world down before she let anyone take it from her. For 2 days, Clara and Elizabeth survived in the woods. Clara's knowledge of the wild, something she'd picked up exploring the hills around Willowbrook, kept them alive. She found edible berries, fresh water, and sheltered them in the hollow of an ancient tree. But she knew it wasn't sustainable. Elizabeth was getting weaker. Clara's own strength was failing. On the 3rd day, she stumbled onto a real road, and not long after, she heard the sound of an approaching carriage. It wasn't a farmer's wagon. It was a fine, elegant coach, the kind she'd only seen in pictures. It pulled to a stop, and the woman who looked out the window was just as elegant as the carriage. She was in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and clothes that spoke of serious money. "Good heavens, child," the woman said, her voice crisp and commanding. "What has happened to you?" Clara, desperate, told a modified version of the truth. She said she was a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, that she was trying to get to Portland to find work. She left out the part about being a fugitive from a baby-selling prison. The woman studied her for a long moment, her gaze missing nothing. The cuts on Clara's hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce way she clutched her baby. "My name is Vivian Ashford," the woman said finally, "and I don't believe a word you just said, but I do believe you're in trouble. Get in." That carriage ride changed Clara's life. Vivian Ashford wasn't just a wealthy traveler. She was something else entirely. As they talked, Clara realized Vivian was a master of observation. She saw things other people missed. She understood power, and she understood money. And she had no patience for the rules that society tried to place on women. "The world, my dear Clara," Vivian said, as they shared a meal of bread and cheese from her travel basket, "is a game. A game designed by men, for men. To win, you can't just play along. You have to learn the rules so you can break them more effectively than they do." Vivian wasn't traveling to Portland for pleasure. She was on her way to close a series of business deals. She bought and sold land, invested in shipping ventures, and, as Clara would later learn, ran one of the most exclusive and high-stakes poker games on the West Coast. She saw something in Clara, a flicker of that same hard steel she possessed, a survivor's instinct. Instead of dropping her at an orphanage in Portland, Vivian made a different offer. "You need a place to stay. I need a personal assistant," she said. "Someone intelligent, discreet, and quick to learn. You'll have a room, food, and a small salary. In return, you'll work for me. You'll manage my correspondence, my appointments, my ledgers, and you will watch and you will learn." It was a lifeline Clara grabbed with both hands. The next 4 years were the most intense education imaginable. Clara lived in a small apartment in Vivian's Grand Portland home, raising Elizabeth while absorbing everything her mentor could teach her. She learned mathematics and accounting. She learned contract law. She learned how to read a man's intentions by the way he held his cards, and how to negotiate a deal by exploiting his weaknesses. Vivian was a ruthless teacher. She pushed Clara relentlessly, correcting her mistakes with sharp-tongued precision. But she was also fair. She gave Clara access to her library, introduced her to bankers and businessmen, and treated her more like a protege than a servant. Clara bloomed. The quiet, peculiar girl from Willowbrook discovered she had a genius for numbers and a natural talent for strategy. She devoured books on economics, on industry, on the new technologies that were changing the country. She managed Vivian's empire with terrifying efficiency, all while raising a daughter who was growing up surrounded by books, maps, and conversations about capital and leverage. Elizabeth learned to count by stacking poker chips and learned her alphabet from the stock tickers. But Vivian taught Clara one final, crucial lesson. "Never let them know everything," she said one evening as they sat in her study overlooking the city lights. "Always have a secret, an advantage. Information is the most valuable currency in the world, Clara. More valuable than gold. And the best information is the kind your opponent doesn't know you have." When Clara was 18, Vivian called her into the study for a final meeting. "I've taught you everything I can," Vivian said. "You're no longer my assistant. You're my equal. And this city isn't big enough for both of us to play the same game. It's time for you to build your own empire." Vivian gave her a parting gift, $10,000 in cash, a staggering sum. "It's your back pay," Vivian said with a rare smile, "and my investment in your future. Don't disappoint me." Clara Morrison was now 18 years old. She had a brilliant 4-year-old daughter, a substantial amount of capital, and a mind honed into a razor-sharp weapon. She was ready to play the game, and she had the perfect first move in mind. There was a man in Portland, a shipping magnate named Silas Croft. He was one of Vivian's rivals, a ruthless bully who had built his fortune by crushing smaller competitors. He was also a man with secrets. Using the skills Vivian had taught her, Clara started digging. She spent weeks gathering information, talking to disgruntled former employees, poring over shipping manifests and public records. She discovered that Croft was cheating his investors. He was using his ships to smuggle goods, avoiding taxes and tariffs, and hiding the profits in a series of shell companies. It was a complex web of deceit, and Clara mapped out every single thread. But she didn't go to the authorities. That wasn't Vivian's way. Justice was a tool for the weak. For the strong, there was leverage. Clara used her capital to quietly buy up a significant amount of Silas Croft's debt from smaller creditors. Then she invested in his biggest competitor, a struggling but honest shipping company run by a man Croft was trying to bankrupt. With all her pieces in place, she requested a meeting. Croft laughed when his secretary told him a Mrs. Morrison wanted to discuss a business proposition. He agreed to see her out of sheer arrogant curiosity. He stopped laughing the moment Clara laid a single damning piece of evidence on his desk, a ledger detailing one of his smuggling runs. "This is just a sample," Clara said calmly, her voice even. "I have the rest, enough to send you to prison for 20 years and dismantle your entire operation." Croft's face turned a mottled shade of red. He blustered. He threatened. Clara just waited. "What do you want?" he finally snarled. "Money? I already have money," Clara replied. "I want your company." Her proposal was brutal in its simplicity. He would sell his entire shipping line to her for $1. In exchange, the evidence of his crimes would disappear. He could retire quietly, keeping the money he had already stolen, and avoid prison. Croft stared at her, this young woman who looked barely old enough to be out of school, and saw not a girl, but a shark. He saw the same ruthless intelligence he saw in the mirror every morning. He had no choice. He signed. Overnight, Clara Morrison became the owner of one of Portland's largest shipping companies. She immediately fired Croft's corrupt managers and promoted the honest, hard-working people he had overlooked. She honored his debts, renegotiated his contracts fairly, and within 6 months, the company was more profitable than ever. She had taken down a titan, not with a cannon, but with a whisper. And as she stood on the docks watching her ships being loaded with cargo, with little Elizabeth holding her hand, Clara felt the first real taste of power. She had learned Vivian's lesson well, but this was just the beginning. She wasn't just building a business. She was building an arsenal, and one day she was going to aim it directly at a small town in Montana. For the next 9 years, Clara's star ascended with meteoric speed. The shipping company was just the foundation. She diversified, expanding her empire with a methodical and ruthless precision. She started a food provisions company, Morrison's Premium Provisions, after realizing her own ships could transport goods more reliably and cheaply than her competitors. She secured exclusive contracts to supply remote mining camps and railroad construction crews, using the same model she'd used to take down Silas Croft. Find a corrupt supplier, gather leverage, and force a buyout. Each acquisition was a masterclass in strategy. She never used brute force. She used information. She built a network of informants, clerks, secretaries, telegraph operators, who fed her a steady stream of intelligence about her rivals. She knew whose business was failing, who was cheating on his wife, who was skimming from their partners. She became a ghost in the machine of Western commerce, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. Mrs. Morrison, a young widow, they said, who had inherited her late husband's genius for business. Clara let the rumor stand. It was a convenient fiction that explained her success without revealing her methods. Elizabeth grew up at the heart of this empire. She wasn't just Clara's daughter. She was her apprentice. By the age of 10, she could analyze a financial statement better than most seasoned accountants. By 12, she was sitting in on high-stakes negotiations, her quiet presence often unnerving the men on the other side of the table. They saw a child, but Clara saw her secret weapon. Elizabeth often noticed details her mother missed, her young mind unburdened by preconceived notions. But through all the years of building and expansion, Clara never forgot Willowbrook. She subscribed to the Montana newspapers. She paid private investigators to send her regular reports on the town and its inhabitants. She knew everything. She knew that the Blackwood Ranch was struggling, the cattle market had taken a downturn, and Joshua, who had inherited his father's arrogance but not his business sense, had made a series of bad investments. He was deep in debt, mortgaged to the hilt. She knew that her own father, Thomas, had died of a broken heart 2 years after she left, the shame and grief having worn him down to nothing. The smithy had been sold to pay off the debts Richard Blackwood had engineered. She knew her mother, Margaret, had gone to live with a sister in Utah, a frail, broken woman who rarely left her room. Clara filed each piece of information away, adding it to the ledger in her mind. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about accounts, and a balance sheet that was screaming to be settled. Her opportunity came in the form of a geological survey map she acquired from a disgruntled engineer at the territorial office. The map showed a massive untapped copper deposit, one of the richest in the entire Rocky Mountain range, and the heart of it, the mother lode, was located directly beneath the rolling pastures of the Willowbrook Valley, right under Joshua Blackwood's ranch. A lesser person might have simply exposed the information, letting a rush of prospectors descend on the town, destroying the rancher's way of life. But Clara's plan was far more elegant, far more complete. She wasn't going to destroy Willowbrook. She was going to own it. First, she created a new corporation, Morrison Mining Enterprises, a subsidiary of her main holding company, its ownership deliberately obscured. Next, she sent her most trusted geologist, a man named Nathan Prescott, to Willowbrook. He was to pose as an independent prospector. His job was to discover the copper, but only after Clara gave the signal. The third step was the most crucial. She started a rumor, not in Montana but hundreds of miles away, in the financial centers of Denver and San Francisco. The rumor was subtle. A blight was affecting the cattle herds in central Montana. It wasn't true, of course, but in the world of commodities, perception is reality. Cattle prices for the region began to dip. The banks that held the loans on the Willowbrook ranches started getting nervous. They began to tighten credit. For ranchers like Joshua Blackwood, who were already on the edge, it was a death sentence. The phantom cattle blight was the final push that sent them spiraling toward bankruptcy. They were desperate. They were terrified. They were perfectly primed for a savior. With all the pieces in place, Clara gave Nathan Prescott the signal. He made his discovery, filing a claim on a small piece of public land at the edge of the valley. News of the copper strike hit the desperate town like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly, the land they thought was only good for grazing might be worth a fortune. But they had a problem. They didn't have the capital to fund their own mining operations. And with the cattle market in a slump, no bank would give them the loans. Their land was suddenly priceless and worthless at the same time. And that's when the polite, well-dressed lawyers from a mysterious Portland-based company called Morrison Mining Enterprises arrived in town. They came bearing salvation. They weren't interested in a messy land grab, they explained. They wanted to be partners with the community. They made an offer that seemed too good to be true. They would pay the ranchers a generous cash sum up front for the mineral rights to their land, a sum large enough to pay off their debts and secure their futures. The ranchers would even get to keep their land and continue their ranching operations. In addition, they would receive a percentage of the profits from the mine, lifelong royalties. It was a miracle, a lifeline from out of nowhere. One by one, the struggling ranchers signed the contracts, their hands shaking with relief. They were saved. The last holdout was Joshua Blackwood. His ranch was the largest, and it sat on the richest part of the copper vein. The entire plan hinged on him. Clara's lawyer, a shrewd man named Samuel Torres, handled the negotiation. He knew from Clara's files that Joshua was just weeks away from foreclosure. Joshua was suspicious. The deal was too good. "Who is this Mrs. Morrison?" he kept asking. "A very private investor," Torres would reply smoothly. "She believes in the potential of this community." For 3 days, Joshua held out, his pride warring with his desperation. His wife, Rebecca, begged him to sign. The creditors were calling daily. They were about to lose everything. On the 4th day, Joshua Blackwood broke. He signed the contract. He sold the mineral rights to his land, the land that had been in his family for generations, to a woman he didn't know. He accepted a check for $50,000, a fortune that would solve all his problems. He had no idea he had just sold his soul back to the devil he'd created 14 years ago. From her temporary headquarters in a neighboring town, Clara received the telegram from Torres. "Blackwood is ours." She folded the piece of paper, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. She now owned the ground beneath every single one of her enemies. "Elizabeth," she said to her daughter, who was sitting across from her, reviewing the signed contracts. "It's time. Have the coach prepared." "Are we going to Willowbrook, Mom?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes," Clara said, her voice soft but laced with iron. "We're going home." The entrance was perfectly timed, market day. The whole town was gathered. When the magnificent black coach, a custom-built marvel of leather and brass pulled by 4 perfectly matched horses, rolled down the main street, it was like a scene from a play. Everything stopped. The woman who stepped out was a vision. The name Clara Morrison rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. It was a name from a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to daughters who were getting too bold. But this was no ghost. This was a queen, and she was stepping onto a chessboard of her own design. She walked straight to the center of the crowd, her daughter Elizabeth at her side. Her eyes found Joshua Blackwood, who stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Hello, Joshua," Clara said, her voice ringing out in the sudden silence. Before he could form a word, she turned to the crowd, to the faces of the people who had judged her, condemned her, and cast her out. "I believe you've all been doing business with my company," she announced. "Morrison Mining Enterprises." A confused murmur went through the crowd. "The contracts you all so gratefully signed," Clara continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife, "have made me the sole owner of every ounce of copper in this valley. The ground you stand on, the land your cattle graze on, it belongs to me now." She let that sink in. She watched their faces shift from confusion to fear as they began to understand the scale of what had happened. They hadn't been saved. They had been conquered. Then she turned her gaze back to Joshua. Her expression was unreadable. You took everything from me, Joshua. My home, my family, my name. You in this town, you left me with nothing. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. So I decided, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, to come back and take everything from you. Rebecca, Joshua's wife, finally found her voice. You can't do this. We have contracts. They're legally binding. Clara almost laughed. Oh, my dear, she said, turning to Rebecca with a look of pity. Your contracts are the very chains I will use to bind you. They are perfectly legal. I had the best lawyers in the country draft them. They give me the right to build roads, divert rivers, and construct any facilities necessary for my mining operations. Your ranching way of life is over. Your land is now an industrial site. She looked back at Joshua. I own your future, she said softly, just like you thought you owned mine. And then came the final, most devastating blow. She gestured to Elizabeth, who had been watching the scene unfold with a calm, unnerving intelligence. And there's one more thing you should know, Clara said. The debt you owe me isn't just financial. Joshua, I'd like you to meet your daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Joshua stared at Elizabeth, this tall, poised, beautiful young woman. He could see it now, the shape of his own eyes, the line of his jaw. The truth was undeniable, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a business transaction. This was a life's work of vengeance, reaching its terrible, beautiful conclusion. Clara had not come back to reclaim a place in their world. She had come back to burn their world to the ground and build her own on the ashes. The town of Willowbrook was in shock. They had been outmaneuvered by a ghost. The contracts were ironclad. Clara Morrison owned their future, and there was nothing they could do about it. They expected her to be a tyrant. They expected her to evict them, to take pleasure in their ruin. But Clara's plan was never about simple destruction. It was about reconstruction on her terms. She called a town meeting. It was held in the same church where Reverend Patterson had once condemned her. She stood at the pulpit, not as a penitent, but as a CEO. I know you're all afraid, she began, her voice calm and measured. You think I've come here for revenge? You're wrong. She looked out at their faces, the Hendersons, the Cartwrights, all the people who had stood by and watched her be exiled. Revenge is a poor substitute for profit, she said, a line she'd learned from Vivian. What happened 14 years ago was a business transaction. This town decided I was a bad investment, and they cut their losses. I'm here today to tell you that I am a very good investment, and I'm offering you all a chance to get in on the ground floor. Her proposal was audacious. She wasn't going to destroy their ranches. She was going to hire them. The new Morrison mine would need beef to feed its thousands of workers. It would need timber, it would need transportation, it would need services. She offered contracts to every family in the valley. They could keep their homes, keep their land, and make more money than they had ever dreamed of, all by working for her. Joshua Blackwood would supply the beef. The Henderson store would become the official company commissary. The sons of the men who had scorned her father would find steady, well-paying work in her mine. She was not offering forgiveness. She was offering a golden cage. They would all get rich, but they would do it under her name, by her rules. Their prosperity would be a monument to her power, and they accepted. Every last one of them. What choice did they have? The transformation of the valley was swift and total. Within 5 years, the quiet ranching community was gone, replaced by a bustling industrial hub. 3 new towns full of miners and merchants sprang up around the main mining sites. The railroad spurs she built connected them to the rest of the world. She renamed the central town. Willowbrook became Morrison. She built a new school, the finest in the territory, in a modern hospital. She funded it all herself. Her name was on everything. Joshua Blackwood adapted. He became a wealthy man, wealthier than his father had ever been. But the power was gone. He was a contractor, a supplier to the queen. He tried on several occasions to speak with Elizabeth, to form some kind of relationship. Elizabeth, now a young woman preparing to leave for university in California, treated him with a polite, impenetrable coolness. She felt no anger toward him, but she felt no connection either. Her world had been built by her mother. This quiet, defeated man was a stranger to her, a biological footnote. One evening, Clara stood with Elizabeth on the balcony of their new home, a grand house built on a hill overlooking the valley. The lights of the town of Morrison twinkled below them. The sound of the mine's stamp mills provided a constant, rhythmic pulse, the new heartbeat of the world she had created. "Are you happy, Mama?" Elizabeth asked. Clara considered the question. Happy wasn't the right word. She was satisfied. The ledger was balanced. The accounts were settled. "I am content," Clara said. "I built something that will last, something that will provide for thousands of people. I took the worst thing that ever happened to me and I turned it into this." She had won in the most absolute way possible. She hadn't just defeated her enemies. She had erased them, rewriting their world so completely that the story of the past no longer mattered. All that mattered was the present she had forged. The girl who was cast out in shame had returned and become the foundation upon which everything was built. The town had tried to bury her, but they had only succeeded in planting a seed, and Clara Morrison's garden had grown to cover the entire valley. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got new tales of justice and consequence coming every week, and you won't want to miss what we have in store. Click the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one.